Hi everybody, my name is Lauren and I live in Mexico. I'm originally from the US. I've lived in Mexico for almost 8 years. My husband is Mexican, my children are born in Mexico, and I just wanted to make a video that would hopefully be helpful for a lot of foreigners who are either thinking about moving to Mexico or who are currently living in Mexico about some of the mistakes that are pretty common for people to make when they are first coming to Mexico. So hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and other people's that I have seen or read about or talked to people about. So don't feel bad if you have made any of these mistakes. They are really common. And these won't apply in every situation, but they're just important things to keep in mind so that you kind of know what's normal, what's not normal, and what to expect as far as renting where you go to rent in Mexico. So the first thing that's really important to keep in mind is that when you rent an unfurnished apartment in Mexico, it means just that. It is going to be completely unfurnished. So you should not expect to see a refrigerator, a stove, any type of washer. If it does have these things, that's a really great benefit, but definitely don't expect that. So you would need to purchase those items. But what you should expect to have, you should expect to have a water heater, and there's 3 different kinds. And you should expect for there to be some type, there's different houses, different apartments do it in different ways. So I won't get into all of that, but there should be some way for the owners to have adequate water supply for you. So normally you're going to have a water container on the roof, and then it's going to come down from there. So you should have a water container, and you should have a water heater. Now the water heater, you could have a solar water heater, which is what we put in our house. I think it's the best one because once it's installed, you don't have to do anything with it. And most places, well, where we live, it's really sunny, so it's solar, the sun is free, and it just heats our water. We always have hot water. You could also have an electric water heater, which is really important to know if you do have that, because that's really going to affect your electricity bill, which I'll talk about later. So it's really important to ask about that, what kind of water heater you have. And then there's 2 types of gas water heaters. There's the de paso, which basically you would light your water heater and it would heat the water as you would need it. So you would hear it turn on and off as you would use the hot water. And then there is another water heater that's kind of similar more to the US, but it's old-fashioned. You wouldn't see it that as much. But it's also gas, where you would have a set amount of water that would be heated by gas. And so if you were to take a long shower or something, you would run out of hot water and you would have to wait for it to come back. So those are the different types of water heaters. As far as having a gas cylinder for your water heater, some places might have that. Some places you would have to get that. Some places would have a stationary gas container on the roof, and you would be expected to pay for that. So that's another thing to keep in mind if you do have a gas water heater, is where is that gas coming from? Do you have to buy the container? Where would you get your gas? Things like that. So those all are important things to understand or think about. Also, sometimes they'll tell you, like for the de paso ones, that you can leave it lit all the time. I definitely wouldn't recommend doing that, especially because a lot of times the water heaters are outside. So what can happen is that you light your water heater, and if it gets blown out, like by the wind or just through time, that means that your water heater is outside just leaking gas, which is definitely not safe. So most Mexicans, what they'll do if they have that type of water heater is they'll only light it when they are going to take a shower, or if you're going to be using water heater, or using hot water, using the water heater. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Another really important thing and this may or may not apply to the area that you're moving to, is water. So how often are you getting water, and what type of situation does your landlord have set up to store water if they're not getting it constantly? So like where we live right now, we always have water, but in a lot of places, that's not how it is. And this can also vary by street even, or by neighborhood. So even if you know somebody in the same city as you and they don't have any problems with their water, maybe you will, or vice versa. So for example, where we were living in Mexico City, we had water every few days, and we had enough space to be able to store it, so that we didn't run out of water. But just 2 streets over, we had a family member who got water like hardly ever, like maybe every few months. And he had a system set up so that he could store his water. He had like underground, they call them cisterns, which I know we use a little bit differently in English, but like basically water containers to store his water. And he didn't have any problems. But there was also another lady on the same street as him who was renting. She could never keep renters because she just had a small little water container, so people would rent and then they would quickly find out that they ran out of water. So it's really an important thing to keep in mind, that it's one of the major things that a lot of foreigners don't think to ask about. And it may not have even been an issue in your previous place that you were renting, but it could easily become an issue. So even if you find the best apartment in the world, if you don't have like water to flush your toilet with, it's very quickly you're not going to want to stay there. So that's really, really probably one of the most important things that foreigners don't think about when they are renting in Mexico. And it's one of those things that even if you've lived in Mexico for years, maybe you've never run into that problem before, but you easily could. So the next thing that's really important that I kind of touched on a little bit before is the electricity. So we were thinking about renting in a place one time, and the landlord had 3 units, and they were all combined, so they were all on the same electrical meter. And obviously you can imagine, like, that's just a recipe for disaster. It's just a recipe for neighbors to start having problems with each other. But it's especially an issue when you're in Mexico because of the way the electricity is set up. So in Mexico, where we live right now, and this can vary slightly, but not too much. So there's going to be 3 layers or 3 levels of what you would pay for your electricity costs. So the first level, and this is for every 2 months, is going to be 89 Mexican cents per kilowatt. So this is up to if you don't spend more than 150 kilowatts for 2 months. So this is why a lot of Mexicans are very conscious about how much electricity that they're using, because of this system. The second layer, I believe it's if you go over 250, but I could be wrong about that, kilowatts. You're going to pay about $1 per kilowatt. So it just goes up, but you can think that adds up pretty quickly. The third layer is going to be 3 pesos per kilowatt. So you can see how very quickly, very easily, your electricity bill can just triple. So not only are you going to be paying more because you're using more, but you're actually going to be paying 3 times as much per kilowatt. And if this continues, so if you're on this third level, this high level, for a certain number of months, they will keep you at that level. So even if you try to go down, like you try to be conscious about your electricity, you're still going to be paying those 3 kilowatts, those 3 pesos, per kilowatt, for a certain amount of time until they determine that you can be put back down again. So that's really important to keep in mind. And also, obviously, if you're going to be sharing the electrical costs with other tenants, everybody's going to be using more, so it's going to put you at this higher level. And so if your neighbor, for example, if you're maybe you're on the bottom floor and your apartment is really comfortable, but the third floor, he's using an air conditioner all the time, you're actually paying for his air conditioning. So that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. It's also important to keep in mind, like I said, that you're going to be paying for every 2 months. So if you start renting in the middle of July, you should ask, was somebody renting here in June? Are you expecting me to pay for June and July? Like, those are things that you need to ask the landlord about. What are their expectations? And definitely, I wouldn't recommend doing that, but it's just, you can ask, like I wouldn't recommend paying for the previous tenant, but you can ask about that. The electricity is going to be in the name of the owner, so that would be pretty common. They should have no problem showing you the bill. So if you ask to see the bill and say, well, how much was the previous tenant paying? They should be able to show you that bill. That's not something that you should feel uncomfortable asking about. If they are going to come to you and say, oh, the electricity for the last bill was, X amount of pesos, please pay me or whatever, you should ask to see that bill. If they don't want to show it to you, that's a red flag. That's probably, it's just not a good sign. Like, there's nothing wrong with asking to see that. And your meter for your apartment, it should be like your specific meter will be outside, and that's when they come to check the electricity, or wherever the guy comes to check the electricity, that will have your number. You can write that down so that you have an idea of where you're at, and then how much it goes up from there, so how many kilowatts you've spent. This can also help you to determine if your landlord is being honest with you, if they're being a little shady. Because if they're being shady about electricity, they're probably being shady about other things, or it's just not a good sign. So it's something to keep in mind. And they should have no problem with you doing that. None of those things would be, like, most Mexicans would do those things. It would be a normal thing to do. So if they're, putting up resistance, or they seem like not happy with you asking those types of questions, that's also a red flag. So those are just important things to keep in mind when you're renting. I really definitely wouldn't recommend renting somewhere where you're sharing electricity with your neighbors, because even if you're okay with it, it's just, you're just asking for people to complain with you, or you complain. It's just not good. Don't do it. I wouldn't recommend it. So the next thing, just to keep in mind, is internet. So for a lot of foreigners, we work online, or we have jobs where we, need a certain speed of internet, or we just like to watch movies. So it's important to keep in mind that even if the same company is all over your city, especially if it's a smaller, but even in larger cities, they might not have a certain speed where you live. So if they say, oh, we offer up to, 1,000 megabytes per whatever second, then that might not be on the actual street where you're living, because of how their infrastructure is set up. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind, that if you're really seriously considering renting somewhere, especially if it's not, like, if it's a little bit off, maybe but even if it is, like, it's just important to keep in mind that if you need a certain speed of internet, definitely check with the internet company to make sure that whatever speed that you need is available at the actual address that you're planning to rent. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. The next thing is just any extra cost. So they might say, well, this is the rent, and that's, fine, but are there any extra costs involved with living in the location that you want to live? So, for example, they might put the rent down a little bit lower, and then they might say, oh, but you have to pay, 2,000 pesos for maintenance and security. A lot of people don't do that, but it could happen, and it's just an important thing to ask about, to say, okay, do you charge for maintenance and security, and how much? So by security, usually that's not usually it's just the people that, if you live somewhere where they open the door, or there's some kind of a gate, or there's some kind of a thing where you have people in the front, that would be a cost. If you have people that clean, if there's a pool, if there's anything like that, obviously those would involve extra costs. It doesn't necessarily mean anything shady, but it is an important thing to ask and not just think that, oh, it's a nominal cost or, oh, it's included in the rent. It might not be. So it's an important thing to ask. Another important thing to keep in mind, and this is somewhat controversial, I guess, but it's up to you to think about. And it's called póliza jurídica, which is, it is what your landlord will pay to protect themselves in case you don't pay for something or you want to leave. A lot of places and a lot of landlords will say that it covers both the tenant and the landlord, and it's just up for you to decide that. But from practical purposes, really there's not a lot of added benefit for you, in my opinion, as the tenant. It's really more for the landlord. It's starting to become, I think especially in Mexico City, a little bit more common for landlords to ask the tenants to pay this or pay part of it. It's definitely not the norm. So if they're asking you to pay that, that's up to you if you want to pay that, but just understand that from a practical perspective, it's probably not going to benefit you. And that's not necessary. Like, it's not the norm to do that. That would be something extra that they're asking you to pay for. So don't think that everywhere would ask you to pay for that. Another important thing to keep in mind as far as extra costs go is going to be gas. So like I touched on before, do you have to buy your cylinder, like a gas tank? Is there gas on the roof, the stationary gas on the roof that you're going to be splitting with the other tenants that they're going to ask you to pay for? How much is that going to be? It's just important things to keep in mind, that it's not just going to be the rent, that those could be extra added costs. Also ask about the water. Is water included in your rent? Are they going to ask you to pay extra for the water? That's an important question to ask. Even things like trash pickup. So this isn't everywhere, but there are places that it's usually not a lot, but they might come to your house and say, oh, we want you to pay, I don't know, 30 pesos for the trash, or 20 pesos or whatever. It's just an important thing to ask. It's usually not a lot, but it's just things to keep in mind when you're renting, that it's not just the rent, and some of these things may not be included. Another important thing to keep in mind when people are renting, and this is really common that you'll see this asked for in a lot of cities in Mexico. Certain cities it's more common than in others, and that is an aval. So an aval is basically what it is like it's a cosigner. So it's somebody who owns property, and usually they want that person to be in Mexico, in the city where you're renting. So they want this person to co-sign for you, and they're basically agreeing that if you don't pay or you don't do something, the landlord can come to them and get the money from them. So obviously if you're foreign, or even if you're Mexican and you're renting somewhere, a lot of times you're not going to have this aval or somebody who's willing to do that, because they have to literally show up and they are legally taking responsibility for you. A lot of times when people are asking for the aval, they just want you to pay extra money. So it's like a way to say, oh, you don't have an aval, well, you need to pay this extra whatever. You can negotiate it. So a lot of people will say, or I've seen some people say online, oh, they asked for an aval, but I didn't have it, so I just paid extra. And it's yeah, that's what they wanted to begin with, probably. Most people, so it's a common thing to ask for. It doesn't necessarily mean anything bad, but just understand that that's probably the intention behind it. It might not be, but it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind and to understand what it is. So the last thing that I have here is talking about so like the factura and the price. So what is a factura? A factura is it can be kind of confusing when you first come to Mexico to understand what it is. It's not just a receipt. A factura is like an official receipt for official purposes, for tax purposes. And if your landlord may not want to give you the factura. If they don't want to give that to you, it's probably a sign that they're not paying taxes. That's up to you, whether, you know, how you feel about that. The factura is, you may need that to get a job in Mexico. You also may need that for immigration. So later on, if you ever choose to get your visa in Mexico, it's possible that you would need a factura to prove a certain level of income. I didn't need that because my immigration was through family, but it is possible that you would need that. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. You know, it's also important to keep in mind that I think some people think, oh, it's Mexico, you know, there are no rules or there are no like laws, but like there are certain things like to keep in mind. So if your landlord is asking you to pay in cash, they don't want you to make deposits, they don't want to give you any type of receipt, that is a really big red flag. They should be willing for you to make a deposit in the bank so that you have proof that you have paid them. And like they shouldn't just expect you to hand them cash. Like just because it's Mexico, like that's not normal. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. Like I said, they may or may not feel comfortable like giving you the factura, and that's between you and the landlord. But yeah, they should definitely be okay with you making a deposit. They should definitely be okay giving you some type of receipt, even if it's not an official receipt. They should be comfortable showing you, if they're asking you for to pay extra for water, they should be comfortable showing you the water bill. If they're asking you to pay your electrical bill, they should be comfortable showing you the electricity bill, even though it's in their name. Like those are things like that are normal to ask for. If they're not showing you those things, that can be definitely a red flag. Another important thing to keep in mind is definitely I would recommend not paying too much in advance, because you're really opening yourself up to being taken advantage of. So if you have a lease for 6 months, don't pay your 6 months all at once, please, because you're really opening yourself up that if they decide 2 months in that they want to rent it to somewhere else, especially if it's in a trendy neighborhood or a touristy place, they're like, oh, I can find this other foreigner that will also give me 6 months. Of course, not everybody will do that, but you're leaving yourself open for the potential of abuse when something like that happens. So it's normal to ask for first and last month's rent and a deposit. If they're asking for anything more than that, like I said, with the aval, sometimes they might ask for extra money if you don't have that. That's up to you if you feel comfortable with that. But if they're asking for anything extra besides that, that's not normal, and definitely could potentially be a red flag. Also, if they're asking you to pay in dollars, so it's one thing if they translate the money and they're trying to be helpful and they're like, well, you know, it's this amount of pesos and it's this amount of dollars. But if they are literally asking you to pay in dollars, or they're asking you to change how much your rent would be based on the dollar, that is really a bad sign. That's really a red flag. And please don't do that, because it does affect, like gentrification is a problem in especially a lot of smaller touristy Mexican cities. And even if that's not your intention, or your intention is, you know, to be helpful, it does actually hurt a lot of, you know, regular Mexicans. Maybe not, even if it's not in your neighborhood, it has like a, you know, the butterfly effect. It has that effect where, you know, you're paying in a currency that a lot of Mexicans don't have access to. and it's driving up the prices in a lot of places. And so it is really important. So, you know, please don't pay in dollars. Like I said, it's different if they say, oh, 12,000 pesos is $600, but they're willing to take your money in pesos. That's a different situation. But if they're actually wanting you to pay in dollars, that is a big red flag. Like I said, if they're asking you to pay in cash and they don't want you to do a deposit, that is not a good sign either. So these are all different things that just to keep in mind, so that you know what is normal, what's not normal, what you can ask for, what you shouldn't ask for. And it also gives you a sense of if they are doing something, like if they do provide something extra or they are doing these things, that they are trustworthy and that they are maybe even going the extra mile, because there are a lot of really great landlords too. And it just helps you to know what questions to ask, what things to keep in mind, and so that you hopefully have a decent experience and can avoid some of the pitfalls as far as renting goes in Mexico. So hopefully this video was helpful for you and provided some things to keep in mind when you're looking for an apartment, and I hope that you have a successful time. If you have any questions or would like to know any other information, please ask me. I will be happy to make future videos about it or answer any questions that you might have. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.